everyone. It's a pleasure to join you here today, and I'm really, really grateful for the people who organized this conference and gave me the chance to participate. I also want to thank to Alessandro about this global Bergson bibliography because it helped me to a lot to find these sources and utilize for them. So in this presentation, I will focus on Ottoman Turkish woman author Halide Edib and her Bildungsroman Sinekli Bakkal through the lens of Bergsonian thought. The novel was initially published in English as The Clown and His Daughter. And specifically, I argue that the novel illustrates a distinctive vision of modernity that is based on Bergsonian concepts such as intuition, Dre, elan vital, and spiritual free will. The versions of the novel differ in language and spiritual emphasis. Therefore, both editions will be referenced in my analysis. To begin with, Sinekli Bakkal is one of the most read and widely analyzed books in terms of the East-West conflict, a familiar theme in the late Ottoman and early Republican Turkish literature. However, it hasn't been thoroughly examined for its spiritual references, such as Mevlevilik, a well-known Sufi order famous for its whirling dervishes. Besides, there have been almost no studies exploring Bergsonian spirituality in Sinekli Bakkal. So rather than reading the novel through the traditional thematic interpretation of the East-West dichotomy, I will introduce a new perspective on Edib's spiritual interpretation of Mevlevi Sufism, influenced by Turkish Bergsonism. However, I need to mention that Edib's interaction with Bergsonism was not direct, but an indirect influence through her intellectual circles in which she attended both in literary and political context. I mean, not like Ahmet Hamdi Tanpınar in Saatleri Ayarlama taking Bergsonian Dre and the mathematical time issue, but it is something like more indirect influence from Ziya Gökalp, Ahmet Hamdi, and like Ahmet Haşim. And let me open this a bit about Ziya Gökalp. You heard about him yesterday a lot, who was known as the follower of Durkheim, later became interested in Bergson, and which is little known that he was interested in Bergson. And he influenced Halide Edib's ideas, especially in the areas of culture and modernization, as well as the distinction between westernization and nationalism. Those areas that Edib was affected by were actually adapted by Gökalp from Bergsonian ideas. And in the beginning of her book, The Turkey Faces West, this is written in English originally, and later again she translated. And there's a saying, as you may see, we come from the east and we go toward the west, Ziya Gökalp. So actually, this is a saying of Ziya Gökalp, and she said in her memoirs in Turkish and in English, she was really affected by Ziya Gökalp's ideas, and she stated that he was later interested in Bergson. And additionally, she wrote for the journal Derga, again, yesterday we talked about it, where Turkish Bergsonism bloomed and developed. And the journal, in turn, praised her literary stance and ideas on modernization, culture, and nationalism. And nevertheless, there is no direct reference stating that she was a Bergsonian again, but there are a lot of clues that she was nurtured by Bergson. Also having two versions of self-translations, which I prefer to call them as rewritings actually, I argue that Bergsonian spirituality can be adapted and reshaped across different cultural contexts. So rather than asking simply the novel is praising being Eastern or Western, I ask what happens when Bergson's philosophy of intuition and creative evolution meets Ottoman Islamic spirituality, and how does this encounter shift when the same story is told in two different languages? So in this talk, I will explore first Halide Edib's personal life and spiritual formation. And under the Bergsonian themes in Sinekli Bakkal, I will analyze how Mevlevi Sufism and Bergsonism converge. And so I will describe how Edib reimagines the East-West relations through a circular durational model of time. And Pablo's main character, protagonist Rabia's intuitive spiritual development reflects Bergson's concepts of elan vital. And finally, Mevlevi Sufism served as a living symbol of continuous becoming organic cultural progress. So, Halide Edip's life as a whole embodies the in-between East and West, tradition and modernity. Firstly, Halide Edib, despite being regarded as the icon of Turkish modernization in her activities and writings, actually in her childhood, she grew up in a very religious environment, raised by a Mevlevi Sufi grandmother, which nurtured her mystical tendencies. This early exposure gave her a deep familiarity with spiritual intuition and the rhythm of Islamic devotional life. At the same time, her father wanted her to receive a modern European education, so she began attending a Greek kindergarten. And she mentioned in her memoirs she really enjoyed and felt relaxed with the Gospels in the kindergarten, while at home she was hearing recitations of the Quran. Later, she was educated at the American College for Girls in Stuttgart, a Protestant missionary school. There she absorbed Western literature and the Bible, and we can see the knowledge in the Bible with the reference to her non-fictional and fictional books. And again, she mentioned in her memoirs that she was almost equally influenced by Mevlid, a poem written to celebrate Prophet Muhammad's birthday and recited on the Kandil nights, which are holy nights in Islam, and the scenes in the Bible that were recited on Christmas Eve describing Jesus' birth. This dual background gave her double literacy and in Sufi spirituality on one side, and in Western rationalism and spiritualism on the other. So during her teenage and high school years, while her household folks told her religious stories, religious and mystical stories about Islamic figures, her private tutor, Nurgül Şener, we talked about him again yesterday, who was one of the first person to introduce Bergson to the Ottoman intellectual circles, introduced her to metaphysical philosophy and Turkish literature. And she said that he was the person who opened the door for me, the mystical world. And her adult life continued this pattern of crossing borders. She lived in Europe and Middle East, writing in both Turkish and English, and cultivated an intellectual network that spanned a variety of cultures. It is this biographical hybridity that prepared her to engage Bergson so productively. Bergson's critiques of mechanistic materialism and intuition resonated with her Sufi inheritance. At the same time, Bergson's concepts of Dre and creative evolution allowed her to integrate Western rationalism with spiritualism. So I argue that she reappropriated Sufism through Bergsonian concepts, thereby shaping her understanding of Mevlevi order. In Sinekli Bakkal, Edip created characters influenced by Turkish Bergsonian spirituality, intertwining their beliefs with the story. According to her, societal progress cannot develop where intellect and science exist alone while spiritual needs are ignored. Therefore, she suggested combining rationality and spiritual elements. Similarly, Bergson proposed that spirituality leads to the truth using science as needed, as the mind and soul are complementary. Thus, when she wrote Sinekli Bakkal, she wasn't simply telling a story, she was offering a spiritual vision of Ottoman Turkish modernization. As we know that positivism was the dominant ideology of that period, and Halide Edib's engagement with modern thought also included positivism, of course, and that shaped her early intellectual identity. Her father, Edip Bey, admired Anglo-Saxon culture and embodied a modernizing Ottoman bureaucrat's rationalist outlook. Again, Rıza Tevfik, who opened the mystical world, was a follower of Herbert Spencer and John Stuart Mill. And Salih Zeki, actually, who was also her mathematician and her teacher, later they got married. and he was a strict follower of Auguste Comte and reinforced this positivist worldview. Together, they co-authored an article titled as Auguste Comte Felsefe Müsbetesi, the positive philosophy of Auguste Comte, where she adopted a language of scientific rationalism and progress. So these moments show that in her intellectual life is crucial and show that Halide Edib was not merely surrounded by positivist thinkers, but also once wrote as a positivist thinker herself. However, this phase didn't negate her spiritual sensibilities, even if she mentioned in her memoirs that her spiritual tendencies were getting lost. Related to this, she said that without setting a balance between soul and mind, she had troubled times psychologically during this period. Whenever she managed to ensure cooperation between them, she experienced a fruitful period, both scholarly and psychologically. Her synthesis of positivism and spiritualism exemplifies to the Bergsonian concepts of becoming, a dynamic process where reason and intuition are not opposites, but the complementary forces of creative evolution. Also, with her second husband, Adnan Adıvar, while he was a physician and a rationalist, he respected her spiritual tendencies. Again, together, they developed an intellectual partnership that mirrored the very balance she later fictionalized as the cooperation of reason and intuition. In her non-fictional works, Edib praised the modernist West, but she always kept the suggestion that we need to preserve cultural heritage. And she suggests a cooperation between the rational, technical, positivist West and intuitive spiritual East. Also, she suggested spiritual growth for Western countries to ensure the way to true knowledge and happiness. In addition to that, Edib praised the modernization models of England and the USA, suggesting evolutionary and technical modernization that incorporates cultural heritage and multinational identity. She openly stated in her non-fictional works again, she found revolutionary attempts violent and non-applicable. However, different from traditional conservatives, Edib proposed an adaptation of West for societal progress by, again, holding cultural heritages, customs, and traditions, but they do not conflict with progress and reason. She meant those customs to be preserved so that people can live easily, happily, and in justice. As Mustafa Şekil stated, şuurlu muhafazakarlık, like selectively or consciously being conservative, Halide Edib suggested modernizing traditions and customs that victimize families, especially women. She didn't call herself as a feminist, but she talked about the problems of women in her age. So, for example, she really disturbed her with the idea of polygamy, for example. And so, this is the thing that generally in Turkish literature, she was described as the ideological shift. But I think that this is rather than an ideological shift, but she displays a consistent in-betweenness and organic co-presence of rational and spiritual thought. She lived what Bergson theorized, that true understanding arises from the harmony between analytical intellect and intuitive vision. So when it comes to the Bergsonian themes in Sinekli Bakkal, let me give a brief description of Rabia, the protagonist of the novel. She is the figure of spiritual, intuitive character, a child of rigorous and bigot mother, and a carefree actor and quite successful in imitating women's roles. We call them as in Turkish as zenne. So they are acting women roles. And Rabia was raised by her grandfather in her father's exile, and she later got married to a former priest, an atheist, and highly materialist Italian musician, Peregrini, who converted to Islam later.
An Italian.
And he's Italian, yes. And first of all, as we all know that Bergson didn't reject reasoning at all, but he criticized the mechanistic approach to all sorts of knowledge. So he suggested following a different medium to understand metaphysical issues, and he offered a cooperation between intuition and intellect. Likewise, Halide Edib fictionalized her characters to show that following one type of methodology for all sorts of knowledge doesn't direct them to true knowledge. There are some scenes and dialogues showing how Bergsonian intuition helped them to find peace and rightness. So, for the details, Rabia is an intuitive person. She's a Hafiz, actually. Hafiz means that she recited Quran by heart. And she needs to learn rationalist thought and benefit from both to do right thing. Raised with a strict and ritualistic version of Islam, Rabia couldn't comprehend true religious knowledge, even if she was a Hafiz, and reach her full potential. She was highly talented in music, by the way. Vehbi Efendi, or Dede, because in English version it is called as Efendi, in the Turkish version is called as Dede. Dede is grandfather, and we call the wise and old people as Dede. And also, as far as I know, it's the terminology that is used in the tekkes, the lodge that the dervishes come together and call each other Can or Dede. And he's a Mevlevi dervish and teaches Rabia classical music, while actually he trains Rabia to trust her intuition, eliminating the mechanical teachings. Pellegrini, who is materialistic, rejects mystical and religious teachings because of the rigidity, but he is unaware that he is not already satisfied with this mechanical and materialistic approach. Through the end of the novel, Pellegrini learned how to use cooperatively intuition and mind from Vehbi Efendi and Rabia. In my opinion, Halide Edib implied that both Pellegrini and Rabia share mystical tendencies similar to her own life, and they need to learn to balance them. Through the true teachings of spirituality and positivism, an individual can achieve happiness and make the right decisions by combining the guidance of intuition and reason. The best example of this cooperation is Rabia's pregnancy and delivery, while Pellegrini, later Osman after the marriage and after the conversion, insist on setting aside all these mystical and spiritual thoughts that Rabia taught and proceeding with pure science. In here, Pellegrini wanted Rabia to end her pregnancy because if she delivers the baby, she will lose her life. But on the other hand, Rabia insists on giving birth to her baby, even if it costs her life. So in here, Pellegrini follows pure reasoning and Rabia acts instinctively. By the way, it is not intuitively, which Bergson made a difference between them. So both needed to integrate intellect and intuition. Therefore, as a mediator, Vehbi Dede warns Rabia to trust her intuition and use reasoning. And he gave you an examples of the Islam to save her life. And he saved it. And after that one, she manages to achieve. She gives birth with C-section, which is still today seen as inappropriate by some conservatives. This can also be an example of an anti for both the baby and Rabia, because she says in the book, I will live, and the baby lived. I'm gonna do this and I will manage, she says. The scenes of Rabia's giving birth and her thoughts during the process are completely intuitive and spiritual. So this is what I'm gonna describe a bit. During the surgery, doctor said that Rabia was reciting the Quran and singing some songs and talking about the devils and angels. Actually, it is implied, but in only English version, it is not in the Turkish version, she imagines herself as the Mother Mary giving birth to Jesus, and she actually recites some parts from the Mevlid, not the Quran, imagining the Prophet Muhammad's birth. Meanwhile, Pellegrini realizes that he also needs to learn, utilize the interaction and cooperation between and intuition. So the other point of intuition in Sinekli Bakkal and the clown and his daughter, her chronic recitations are not technical performances. They emerge from lived emotional and intuitive spiritual experiences which show Rabia's musical sensitivity. and her spontaneous ethical judgments, and her rejection of both rigid orthodoxy and superficial modernization. Those aspects all align with Bergson's idea, I think, that true knowledge arises not only from analytical abstraction, but through aspiration and intuition. Rabia, as constructed by Halide Edib, represents this organic, intuitive understanding of the world. So, different from this East-West dichotomy in Turkish literature, she is deconstructing this. And, you know, what Bergson says about this ray, and I'm not going to repeat it. In Sinekli Bakkal, Rabia's development is not a chronological march, but a flow of inner time. Also, the neighborhood. By the way, the Sinekli Bakkal is the name of the neighborhood. And itself seems to be living outside of history, preserving habitual old rhythm, while wars and political issues change and swirl around it. And Halide Edib's portrayal of the East-West is often misunderstood as a rigid dichotomy. However, unlike her contemporaries who characterized the East and West as linearly conflicting, and generally for Halide Edib's comparison between the East and West in her book is analyzed as like she is praising being Eastern. Actually, no. She interprets this dichotomy as a circular, dynamic, and creative one. The cultural integration of the East-West is portrayed not as a division or conflict, but a synthesis of reciprocal and influence and creative evolution. As a result, in this novel, Sinekli Bakkal, the East and West are not locked in binary conflict and opposition. Instead, they are presented as evolving and mutually influencing forces with a broader and circular temporality. Rather than imaging history as a linear, moving from tradition to modernization, Edib's narrative aligns with Bergson's concepts of ray, where time is experienced as a continuous flowing reality. The novel doesn't depict modernization as a rupture, but as a process of inner transformation in which cultural evolution unfolds like a spiral, deepening rather than discarding its roots. Also, the Mevlevi order embodies this model with artistic practices. Through the Sema ritual, the whirling dervishes enact a cosmic dance of circular time, a physical expression of the ray, where spiritual development is experienced as ongoing movement that continues without interruption. And the discussion between Peregrine and Vehbi symbolizes a fruitful comparison of East and West on the conflict of reason and intuition, praising their cooperation through the Mevlevi understanding. And also, through Rabia, Edib criticizes the rigid notions of modernization and proposes a cultural integration that promotes spiritual growth. Furthermore, the marriage is effectively fictionalized to represent a harmonious integration of the East and West, mind and soul, through the spiritual journey of Mevlevi order. For Turkish Bergsonism, the idea of creative evolution and elam vital could be the most significant one, because Turkish Bergsonians adapted the concept of evolution for the Ottoman modernization in an organic way, while preserving cultural elements. Additionally, elam vital, the driving force of life, was adapted as a motivational source for Turkish War of Independence. However, in Sinekli Bakkal, Halide Edib re-adapted creative evolution, which she used a lot in her non-fictional works and cultural and political articles, as a model of modernization through the vocabulary tekamül, natural evolution in the dimension of spiritual order, drawing from the Mevlevi teachings. Also, Mustafa Şekip Tunç translated the creative evolution as the yaratıcı tekamül. And the Mevlevi order in Sinekli Bakkal is more than a religious sect, by the way, dictating an external doctrines. It encourages becoming in a way that allows human souls to unfold through inner time. The atmosphere of patience and inwardness, musical rituals counters the mechanical time of modernity, instead nurturing organic, fluid spiritual growth. By the way, the fundamentalist Islamic people generally some of them are against this like music in this Mevlevi order, and they think that they are not appropriate for the Islamic understanding. So there are some fundamentals like that. Here to Edib echoes Bergson, just as a long time drives the unpredictable evolution of the life in Bergson's philosophy. The Mevlevi Lodge, Tekke, fosters spiritual transformation cannot be planned or imposed. It is a sanctuary where cultural change is ethical, intuitive, and spontaneous. Halide Edib rejects a purely mechanistic view of modernization, and instead she represents a dynamic, evolving culture where the East and West blend organically. The novel doesn't frame modernization as a rational Western import, but rather as a living and growing cultural process driven by its own vital force. Again, this bird scene can be an example of it. So, the Bergsonian concept, stating true free will, emerges from an individual's inner intuition rather than societal determinism, reflects how Rabia's choices are shaped within this philosophy. In other words, Bergson emphasized that true free will arises not from external pressures but from deep inner consciousness. Similar to his core philosophy, the duality of human mind is an essential part of Bergson's, again, moral theory. He discussed in the two sources of morality and religion. He preferred dynamic over static, and suggested open morality, which is dynamic and aspirational, and creative evolution of morality arising from within, versus closed morality, which is static and driven by social pressure and obligations. With open morality coming from aspiration, Rabia exercises this kind of freedom. She rejects her mother's and grandfather's rigid religious orthodoxy and avoids superficial imitation of West. And her choices emerge from a deeper self, which is again thanks to Vehbi'de's guidance, encouraging the use of cooperation between reason and intuition. In a scene that Vehbi'de comes to Rabia to talk about this ending the pregnancy, she was seeming to cut all her ties with Vehbi'de and standing alone, holding all power in her hands. And in this experience, Vehbi'de could be declared his embodiment of open morality. He helped her actually to do that. So far, we have traced Bergsonian themes in Sinekli Bakkal. However, we must also check how Halide Edib integrated them into Mevlevi order. We can see what kind of modernism she offered within the framework of Turkish Bergsonism. She openly argued for the modernization style in her non-fictional works written in both Turkish and English, such as the book that I showed, Turkey Faces West and Conflict of East and West in Turkey, which were later translated by her, actually adapted into Turkish, I think, because there are some additions and revisions. Her modernization style offered a progress, preserving cultural heritage, and it should be conducted in an evolutionary manner, an organic way. Not like a revolution, because, again, I'm repeating it, that she found it a bit violent and ineffective. Okay, I'm doing it. Additionally, she believed that modernization should include the education of young people with correct religious teaching to heal their minds and souls as well. The religious teaching that she suggested in here is spiritual training, tasawwuf, in her way, the practices of Mevlevi order. In her fictional books, such as Sinekli Bakkal, she created bigoted religious characters who believed this strict understanding of religion, either Islam or Christianity, and as an alternative, she constructed the representation of religious teaching. It should be noted that Sufi adaptation of Turkish Bergsonism is not confined to Mevlevi order. Also, the Bektashi order, another example. There are some studies showing that Rıza Tevfik was really interested in Bektashi, and he combined some Bergsonian concepts with Bektashi spirituality. And I can In Sinekli Bakkal, we can see this differentiation of her understanding. For example, you can see Bergson through Sufism and Ottoman cultural specificity. And in The Clown and His Daughter, we can see Bergson through universal spirituality as to Western readers. So when it comes to the conclusion, she showed that the Bergson's philosophy was never confined to France. It could be absorbed in an Ottoman Islamic framework, fused with Sufism, and then re-exported into English literature. So her novel thus challenges binary models of modernization. Modernity is not simply the imitation of West or rejection of the tradition. It's a process of becoming an inner, intuitive, and creative evolution that draws on both Eastern and Western traditions with its local pace and timing. We can call it as great. In this sense, Halide Edib enriches global Bergsonism by providing a literary source for a case study on the globalization of Bergsonian thought in practice. By weaving Bergson into Mevlevi Sufism, she can reconceptualize modernization as a spiritual, ethical, creative process. By rewriting her story in both Turkish and English, she demonstrated how Bergsonian could itself evolve, appearing differently in each cultural idiom. Ultimately, her novels remind us that Bergson philosophy could cross languages and religions, traditions, becoming a part of ongoing creative evolution of thought. Thanks so much.
So we have time for some questions. You're great.
Yes.
First, so the symbolism of Rabia is very interesting. Rabia Gadawiya. I didn't know. I never read Sinekli Bakkal. Thank you very much for this very rich presentation. I have, two reactions maybe on this. The first is the concept of East-West. And I find it very striking that in Turkey, Bergsonism nourished that much the thought about being Oriental or being Western, because it's not explicit in Bergson's texts. It's typically something that is about the semanticization. Yeah. Okay. And Bergson himself never dealt with this feminist. Yeah. His preferences were towards Christian mysticism. It's very interesting because other novelists in Turkey has also used indirectly or directly Bergsonism. There is, of course, Tanpınar, Saatleri Ayarlama Enstitüsü, and not only this one, his poetry also is very can be read as Bergsonian, but also Peyami Safa. Yes, that I worked on very thoroughly recently on his novels, especially, and there are some. How can I say this? Potential scenes, narrative scenes of the roman of the novels of Peyami Safa, where there is a love trio, let's say, a woman and two men, one of them being more occidentalized and representing really seductiveness, material seductiveness, and the other one, which was not as seductive, but is much oriental, more oriental, spiritual, and so on. And every time the woman goes toward the occidental one, there is a drama. I mean, one is dying or something like that, illness, dying. And when she eventually chooses the oriental man, then everything is okay. So the woman is really the incarnation of Turkish nation, which has to deal with these two elements. And Peyami Safa is also the author of what was the name? The history of Turkish Revolution. İnkılap tarihi. What was it? But evet, İnkılap tarihine bakışlar mı?
Something like that.
Sorry. 1938, I remember the date, but not the exact title. And he explains in this text that what we call East was first rationalist, and what we call West was first mysticism, and that during the history, the West took the rationality, Oriental rationality, as if it was his, and the contrary, sort of chiasm, historical chiasm, where Orient took Christian mysticism as being his. And so he deconstructs the categories of Orient as being mystic and West as being a rationalist. And this is a period, I know Halide Edib was also in contact somehow with Peyami Safa,
Yes.
but I mean there is really something in these novels that are similar, and I didn't know about this. It's your work that that makes me aware of this. And I think maybe to go further, you could also have a look at sort of comparison to other novels, which might be interesting. And just last reflection, but maybe we can talk of this during the last session, is the nature of what you call indirect effect of Bergson, because we are not here in the direct use of Bergsonian. Yes. But we definitely are in a sort of air du temps, Bergsonian air du temps. And okay, there is Zatefic who had an effect, of course, on Halide Edib, but how can we explain this? Is it that this air du temps was really Bergsonian, or is it that Turkish Bergsonism is explicable because of an air du temps which has nothing to do with Bergson? And I think this is really a question if we think about the methodology of doing, I mean, contextualization
Yes.
of philosophers.
Most probably, Hocam. I don't think that Halide Edib read about Bergson or attended the discussion about the Bergson. I think that she was nurtured by Turkish Bergsonian, I guess, as you said, because it is, there's an adaptation like in Turkish Bergsonism. So I don't think that she read about this delay and the duration of time, this kind of thing, but most probably she heard, because she was very close friend of Yahya Kemal and Ahmet Hashim, so they were Bergsonists of the time, and she attended these speeches most probably, but she said in her memoirs that philosophy is complex for her. So most probably she didn't want to go into that, but she turned around it and walk around it. So yes, I will paraphrase my stating about that one.
And she wrote in that book.
Yes, Hocam.
Yes.
Yes, there is no story.
That got first, article, first numéro,
Issue.
the first issue was really that there was sort of claim that it was Bergsonian. I mean, the founders of Derga considered themselves as being Bergsonian and as reading Turkish contemporary history as being a sort of identical Bergsonian. So I think probably she's completely in this.
Yeah, we can say that she directly Bergsonian or she directly like nationalist.
But the question is very interesting. Can we say this? To what extent can we use these terms, these categorizations? What does this mean? And I find it very interesting because this question of this choice of model of imitation that we are embedded in. I mean, whether conscious or unconscious of it, I think it can really be deconstructed while thinking about our own uses of what is an influence, what is a direct or an indirect influence, and to avoid just essentialization of this idea of just an influence of a Western thinker on this Oriental space, which is changed by this thinker, but probably it can be also that the thinker, Bergson, just allow them to let's say to re-semanticize their own conditions.
Yes.
So not changing, it's not changing.
It's localizing actually.
Yeah. This is what your
My encounter with Halide Edib and the Bergson connection actually, hocam, I didn't know Bergson before until to my hocam's class. So I was trying to find the positivist thinker of the Ottoman Empire women because I was studying women's studies. And I realized that Halide Edib was affected by Rıza Tevfik and she had some relationship with the Aga Khan. And also I read that book before Sinekli Bakkal and there's something similar to it here. So it started like that. So I will try to explore more by checking also the Peyam Safa and the other authors.
Yeah, I have a question, but it is related to the same question actually, because I'm not sure, but I think she spent time in Paris.
Yes.
She went into exile with
Yes.
second husband. So isn't it possible that in France, because Bergson was so popular at that time, that
And
she
actually, hocam, she wrote the Sinekli Bakkal's English version, the first version of the book, The Clown and His Daughter, in Paris.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
So maybe it's an important element to answer the question about direct, indirect.
So there could be some direct kind of meeting,
Probably.
some background.
Because Adnan Alba was very connected with philosophers in Paris during this day. So more the empiricists and
Sinekli Bakkal, the neighborhood, the name that she took for her novel, actually Adnan Adıvar's childhood neighborhood. She didn't live there. Actually, she was in Üsküdar all the time in her life and in Beşiktaş. But she wrote from Adnan Adıvar's actually childhood as the Sinekli Bakkal, his childhood neighborhood. So there were a lot of connection between that, but I cannot say that exactly she was impacted by it. So as I said, I will try to explore more about that one.
yes, because the title itself is like a memory.
Yeah.
But she was more Anglo-Saxon, I think. She was really representative of other networks, which was not that French. And even I think she writes somewhere that Paris was just passage.
She was graduate of American Girls' School.
Yeah.
Actually, Robert's College. No, it's Robert's College.
And she writes in English, and I think it's very interesting.
When was she in Paris?
During the 30s, I guess.
Okay.
25 and 30s, after the Republic.
Bergson was alive, but probably she didn't
Not
meet
very available.
but some of the circle, or because so many women, I mean, Emily was writing about so many women were going and listening to Bergson's talk. Could one of these women be a friend of Halide Edib? I think I could don't know. I mean, salon kind of meetings.
And she didn't mention in her memoirs about anything about Paris. And this is also a critique for the other people that she didn't mention.
There were restrictions. She didn't want to say everything.
Yeah, probably.
Other questions?
I will ask a question if I can use my power as moderator to do that briefly. And it kind of follows up on these other questions. You mentioned, and it has been mentioned, that there are other authors at that time who had very explicit Bergsonian interests, perhaps. I'm curious, in your comparative approach, what you think of people like Jakob Kadri Karaosmanoğlu's Nur Baba, in which you have a very different expression of the kind of Sufi dervish relationship. And then you also have an explicit kind of Sufism framework in Hamdi Tanpınar's novel as well. So there seems to be a thread of authors in that period who are approaching this question of what is tasawwuf. And then to reference back to Peyam Safa explicitly writes about something he calls mysticism. So I'm curious what happens, and I asked you this a little bit earlier, that translation from the concept of tasawwuf and its institutional organizational landscape in the late Ottoman period to something called mysticism, which is kind of without any specific reference. Oftentimes the text will have Islamic mysticism separate from the other forms of mysticism. So I'm wondering if you see a kind of literary process in which that distinction is happening. The other component is there any element of Gül Pınarlı's work on Mevlevis and Mevlevilik, he's writing at the same exact time period in that same kind of circle network of scholars, and he's really institutionalizing a history of the Mevlevi order and its conceptual disbursement in the Ottoman context. Does that have any impact on how Halide Edib is thinking about these questions?
I think so. And also, I think it is related to a bit is about the secularism and the positivism being an officially ideology of the how can I say the second Meşrutiyet and after that and also the Republic of Turkey.
Yeah.
So because of that, and they can try to open a space for the religious ideas and the religious life and the spirituality, not being labeled as the infidel. So they can do this through the Sufism and about this spirituality, but they call it as the mysticism. And I don't think that they know the difference between them, they put a difference between them, the mysticism and spirituality yet.
Yeah.
But I think they are going in that way. And also maybe you have heard that about this Peyam Mustafa. For example, in our Turkish literature, as I grew up in Turkey and educated in Turkish high schools, we read Peyam Mustafa, we read, for example, Halide Edib, but we didn't know anything about Bergson. For example, when we analyzed the books of Sabahatleri Ayarlama Enstitüsü, this is directly Bergson. We didn't understand anything because we didn't know anything about Bergson. So in that one, there's something not mentioned. I don't know, maybe it is on purpose, but maybe it's not. So this is a new topic that we are now discussing about it.
Can you ask also the audience, the online attendees if they have any questions or any?
Okay.
Okay. I mean, sometimes they don't have kind of opportunity to ask, but it is free. I mean, anybody who is interested to ask, please just raise your yellow hand.
There's no pressure, and if we do have a question over here as well.
It is aspiration.
Yeah. So this will be our last question, and
thank you for the presentation. I'd like to ask you something about the literary genre. Does writing novels is a way of putting in practice and to test experimentally philosophical ideas, or does and even would you call her a philosopher, even if she wrote novels? Because there is a question with a colleague of mine for vital dissertation about the philosophy of Sophie, the German Enlightenment, and short novel, I should say, just philosophy, and it's like putting in practice and philosophical ideas through the character novels. So, the question about the benefits, it's not a non-canonical, it's non-canonical philosophical corpus. So, how do you intend this genre choice?
Yeah, I'm gonna put it a little bit further women issue, but in here, yeah, as a woman, if you go stand alone and say that I'm a philosopher or I have some ideas to express, and if we consider the age that actually we are talking about in today, it's a little bit hard saying that I'm a scientist or I'm a philosopher. It is really hard. So I think that she uses this methodology as express her ideas better. Because during the period, actually, she was a journalist. She wrote a lot of articles and a lot of non-fictional things, but it is very little known in Turkish context. For example, there are a lot of people, they say, for example, oh really, did she have these books? And I say, yes, she did, but she didn't. And also there are some cases, for example, she talked about this polygamy because she suffered as a child of the polygamous father, and also she suffered as a wife of a polygamous husband. And she wrote in her, like, for example, articles, most probably in the articles she had some censor and censored. And about that one, she like softened this as a kind of, let's make the women happy, and because they're gonna raise our children and our nation and the other stuff. But in her fictional books, we see this very hard, scream of the women that polygamy is dangerous or is breaking the hearts of the women and breaking the family. Like, so yes, I agree. Probably she thinks that the spiritual and the religious teaching of this kind of Islam, or the religious teaching of like Christianity. So because also she is really, I can say, expert in the Bible. So she thinks that we need to open some space for the religious people or spiritual people through her characters, through her stories.
One final quick comment.
Yeah, just one comment again about the Paris thing. So Adiba went in the late 20s. I don't know about
Probably.
but he went in the late 20s.
They were together.
And during the day in Paris, he did the first Turkish translation of Russell. And in this translation, and it was a translation firstly based on the French and the German translation, and he wrote in the preface that it was to become familiar with the English language. And the interesting thing is that the translations and adaptation of Russell by him, he disagrees explicitly with the criticism against Bergson, and evolutionism, and he described himself as a kind of evolutionist. So he used the Tekamül as something, as a progressive philosophy, and he took this word. So I don't know.
I think it's interesting.
Yeah.
There's another asterisk point, and I just confirmed the dates. She wrote explicitly about her travels in India in English, and her engagement with Indian intellectuals at the time, knowing that Muhammad Iqbal, who was also an avid Bergsonian thinker, was also a part of this, and those reflections, memoirs, came out 2 years after Sinekli Bakal was published. So there might be an alternative route too, that she might have engaged with a larger kind of Bergsonian inspired intellectual context, because she spent a number of years corresponding in India. And so that would have been part of her Anglophone, engagement with India.
And in the Anglophone world, it was, the Bergson was associated with cancer and games.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
Very
it
good.
was special.
Okay, round of applause.